So we're looking at now the cell theory, prokaryotes versus eukaryotes, and then we're going to get into cell structure too. So going through all the organelles with you. So this is just something to help you if you need it. We're not going to do these notes in class, but they're here if doing notes does help you. So I'm trying to make it so that we can spend more time on activities in class and not doing the boring notes so that we can do those at home with Canvas. So we're going to give this a shot. So remember that cells are the basic unit of life. We talked about this when we did the characteristics of life. So it's the smallest thing that is considered to be alive. It has all 8 characteristics of life, and it builds the larger organisms that have the 8 characteristics of life. And they were again discovered by Robert Hooke using a microscope in the 1650s. So he looked at the microscope and said, hey, these things kind of look like monk cells. And it kind of all just went from there. And we ended up coming up with the 3 parts of the cell theory and realizing that these cells were actually living things. So one thing to remember about cells is that they all contain a plasma or cell membrane, no matter what kind of cell you are. They all have cytoplasm. So that cytoplasm, again, is like a jelly-like substance that holds in the organelles and has nutrients for the cell in it too. And then every cell contains genetic material too, because remember, they're living. So they have to have some sort of DNA because they're considered living, and having DNA is a characteristic of life. So every cell, no matter what kind, bacteria, animal, plant, fungi, it doesn't matter. They all have a plasma membrane, cytoplasm, and genetic material at the bare minimum. Our 3 parts of the cell theory, so these are super, super important. You're definitely going to have to know the 3 parts of the cell theory. Number 1, all living things are made of at least one cell. So you're either one living cell by yourself, or you're multicellular, so you're made of many cells put together, like humans or plants or a fungus, any of those, like a mushroom. Number 2, cells are the smallest unit alive, so the smallest living thing out there. And then number 3 is that all cells come from pre-existing cells. Before, they thought that cells just kind of spontaneously crystallized, which means that they kind of appeared out of nowhere. But after research and a lot of advances in technology, we know that that is not a true statement, and you actually have to have an already existing cell in order to get a new cell. So looking at the different types of cells, you have prokaryotes. So kind of review from middle school. Prokaryote means they do not have a nucleus. So that prefix pro means before, and karyote means kernel or nucleus. So these are very, very, very old bacteria that are very simple. So not very many organelles, if any at all. Their DNA is just kind of floating out in the cytoplasm, and it's very simple. They don't have a lot of DNA because there's not really a lot of things to control in a prokaryote. So prokaryotes, again, were the first cells. They're way smaller and simpler, so you can tell in our pictures that we have the plasma membrane, maybe a cell wall. Typically, if you're a bacteria, you have some sort of cell wall for protection, maybe a flagellum, and some ribosomes to make proteins. So they're always, always, always single-celled because they're so simple. They don't have the ability to create multi-celled organisms because they're so simple. And again, they're circular DNA, so we have chromosomes in those little X shapes. Bacteria have circular DNA that kind of floats out in the cytoplasm. A eukaryote does have a nucleus. So the way I like to remember it is that you are a eukaryote, so you have a nucleus. You're very complex, so these make the multicelled organism, so they have to have that nucleus and those organelles in there in order to be able to create those multicelled organisms. So again, larger and more complex. They're larger because there's way more stuff in them. They have a lot of things going on. So examples would be plants, animals, and fungi, doesn't matter how you pronounce it. And there are 4 really major parts to these. So they have a plasma membrane, of course. If you're a plant cell, you also have a cell wall, but you at least have a plasma membrane. You have to have cytoplasm, of course. Cytoplasm is that fluid that's inside the cell that has nutrients in it, kind of holds organelles in place. The nucleus as well, that's where the DNA is held. So DNA in the form of chromatin and eventually chromosomes when we get into mitosis. And you also have to have organelles or specialized structures. So think of organelles as like tiny little organs. You have organs in your body, and organelles are kind of like the cell's organs. So they all have a different job that help that cell function, just like your organs have a special job to help you function. All right, so in our different types of cells, remember we have animal cells, plant cells, and bacteria or prokaryotes. So prokaryotes, again, have no organelles, like bacteria. You have your eukaryotes that do have organelles, so animal cells, or you have plant cells. Okay, so we're going to go through the different organelles that are found in both of the plant and animal cells. So before we get into that, cells have three main jobs that they have to do. We're going to organize our organelles into those three main jobs. So they have to be able to make energy or ATP. So we're going to talk about the organelles that do that. You also, as a cell, have to be able to make proteins. We just had a unit on protein synthesis. So we're going to look at the organelles that are involved in protein making. They have a specific job with that. And then you also have to be able to make more cells. Doesn't really help you at all if you can't reproduce. You're around for a little bit and then you disappear. You have to be able to make more of yourself so that the organism can continue to live. All right, so definition of organelles one more time is that specialized structures that do work for a cell. So again, they're like tiny little organs. So the cells that need power. If we are needing power, that means we are making energy. So you need that energy for daily life functions. You also need that, so things that do that would be like the cell membrane. You have the cell membrane letting things in and out of the cell, kind of controlling what's being taken in for energy. We have lysosomes, vacuoles and vesicles, and then the mitochondria and the chloroplasts, the two major organelles that you think of when you think of organelles that are providing energy. So looking at the cell membrane first, the function, its main function is to separate the cell from the outside. So it's keeping all of the organelles inside and keeping most of the bad things out. Sometimes things slip through, but most of the time it does its job. It also is controlling what enters or leaves the cell. So again, controlling things that are entering or leaving. So it is kind of like a security guard. Its structure, it's made of a phospholipid bilayer. So you can see the picture kind of on the left there, on the right there, where you have that yellow circle and those kind of two black wiggly lines. That's a phospholipid. So we've talked about lipids, they're fats. So phospholipids are a type of fat or a type of lipid that make up the plasma membrane. Sometimes you'll hear it called the phospholipid bilayer, and you can see that in the picture at the bottom on the right, where you have two layers of those orange phospholipids. So they're protecting each other. Now, if you have a cell wall, remember the cell wall is more rigid. It's always outside the cell membrane, and typically only plants and fungi have these. Bacteria sometimes do as well, but we're focusing on organelles that are in the eukaryotes. So one more thing that the cell membrane does, it can also communicate between cells. If you look at the picture on the bottom right, you can see the purple carbohydrate chain, kind of looks like a little tree sticking out of the plasma membrane. That's a communication tool and an identification tool. So that neighboring cells can figure out what that cell is and what exactly is going on. So looking one more time at the phospholipid, you have your phosphate head. So the phosphate head is what we call hydrophilic, which means it's okay for it to be around water. But then you have the lipid tail or the hydrophobic tail, and those are not soluble in water. So they have to face inside because they don't like to be around water. So they create this bilayer that looks like this, where you have the tails facing each other and the heads are kind of protecting the tails from being exposed to the water that's inside and outside the cell. All right, vacuoles and vesicles. So they're kind of the same thing. A vesicle is more used for transport, and vacuoles are kind of just storing materials. So their functions are to just move material around the cell. So you can see that green thing on the left kind of getting pulled into the cell and kind of broken down, and then eventually it can also be pushed out of the cell as well. Not only are they moving things around the cell, but they're also going to store things in the cell as well. So you can see that small food particle going into the vesicle, and then you can also have the vacuoles filled with digestive enzymes, so it's breaking down the food. And then you can also, again, push things out of the cell in the same way.